Salutations, audience. My name's still Mike, and you're watching a video that's not quite a deck tech for Rug Delver and Modern this time. The reason this isn't quite a deck tech is I don't think we need another deck tech. Rug Delver still does what Rug Delver always does. It plays a threat, it counters spells, it kills a couple things, and it shoots some burn at your face if that'll finish you off. So I don't think we need to go over the same cards that pretty much do the same thing as they did last time, which was about a month ago, I believe. That's the first video in the playlist if anybody does want to see the deck tech. But I mean, you could probably get the same amount of information from just picking any two matches that I posted and watching them. So I very much don't see a need for a deck tech. However, I want to talk about a few changes that I made to test out some matchups, particularly Death's Shadow, which, when I did the Valakut match and talked about the deck a little bit, MTG Goldfish had Death's Shadow Jund at about 5%. Right now they have it at 8. Ooh, apparently that's very difficult for me to say. 8.5%. Which is, I mean, technically, it's not a huge increase, but that is pretty big. All in all, that puts BGX decks at around nearly 20%. If you count that as a BGX deck, I do. So that's just something to think about. Mid-range is still kicking, and really Death's Shadow is probably going to make mid-range kick a little more, because it's good against linear decks, and probably the best way to beat it is to run a lot of removal. So I imagine mid-range is going to be well positioned. But anyways, let's talk about things we did. First, I'm going to just say what the card changes were, and then I will say why and what I will probably be doing soon, because this is in no way a final draft. This is something I did because I think that's the direction we should be moving in, and it is entirely possible that 90% of the changes that I did become undone, and I change maybe like one card. But I want to do this because this will help me figure out what's good and what is not good. So anyways, we cut one Snapcaster Mage, we added 3 Disrupting Shoals, we added a Simic Charm, we cut a Tarfire, we cut 1 Traverse the Ulvenwald to the sideboard. Lands remain unchanged. And that's it. So, it still isn't that much. I actually thought it was a lot more than I originally intended. We took out 1, technically 2... Oh, we also took out a Bedlam Reveler from the sideboard to make room for that Traverse the Ulvenwald. 1 Snapcaster Mage, 1 Tarfire, 1 Traverse the Ulvenwald. We added a Simic Charm. Where does the other slot come from? 1 Snap, 1 Tarfire, 1 Traverse. There are 60 cards in this deck. I am apparently missing a card that I forgot that I took out, but that is okay. It's entirely possible there was a second Spell Snare, but I don't think there was. What I took out isn't that important, because you can see this deck list, and I don't think you're going to have a lot of trouble seeing my previous deck list, so that's fine. Let's talk about why I did what I did. The biggest change here is the fact that there are now 3 Disrupting Shoals in this deck. Previously I ran 0, so that's a bit of a stark difference. I am very interested in whether or not Disrupting Shoal is good against the new Death's Shadow deck. Disrupting Shoal was very good against the old Death's Shadow deck with Death's Shadow, Monastery Swift Spear, Wild Nacatl, Step Links. You'll notice that those all cost 1 mana. They are 1 CMC creatures. We are very good at using Disrupting Shoal to counter 1 CMC creatures. We have 4, 7, 8, 9, and another 8, 17 blue spells that can pitch 2 Disrupting Shoal to counter a 1 mana spell. That's a lot of cards that can be pitched to Disrupting Shoal to counter a 1 mana spell. You have a very good chance of drawing multiple 1 CMC blue cards throughout the game, so you will probably still be able to play your Delver, maybe fix your draws with a Serum Visions, set up a Mandrills with a Thought Scour, and still be able to slam this Shoal, countering their best 1-drop. That's why Disrupting Shoal is generally good in this deck. Prior to the Traverse version I was running up until recently, I ran a 3-1 split of Shoal and Spell Snare. So naturally that's what I'm going to go with right now, because like I said, this is to test. I want to find out what's good, what works, what doesn't work. So if that was good before, it's probably good now. If it isn't or it needs tweaking, that can be done. To accommodate Disrupting Shoal, you will see a Simic Charm here. That Simic Charm essentially replaces the second Snapcaster Mage to keep up the 2 CMC blue spells. You'll notice we are far worse at countering 2 mana spells for free than we are 1 mana spells for free, just due to the nature of the deck. We like Delver, we like cantrips that enable Delver. Those are all 1 mana spells. 2 mana spells are a lot less common. We have 1 Snap, 3 Leaks, a Simic Charm, and the other Disrupting Shoals that can pitch to each other. So each Disrupting Shoal, if we say that 2 Disrupting Shoals count as blue cards that can pitch to a Disrupting Shoal, since we have 3, if you have 2 in your hand, you essentially have a Shoal that pitches for 2. So we have 1, 4, 5, 7 2 CMC cards that pitch, as opposed to 17 1 CMC cards that pitch. This is because generally you don't care as much about countering 2 mana spells. Firstly, I have my good buddy Spell Snare to cover a bit of that ground. Secondly, 2 mana spells are a lot easier to deal with say Mana Leak. If you're on the play, that's a perfectly even trade. Delver on 1, Leak on 2. It was a good day. If you showed their 1-drop, you probably had a great day, assuming they didn't kill your Delver on turn 3. There's a good chance you just ran away with that game. So we're really a lot more concerned with being able to hit 1-drops. You have Death's Shadow, Path to Exile is pretty much the card we want to see the least in game 1, because it's 1 mana and it gets rid of anything we have. Death's Shadow I only listed because it's now big. It's one of the main reasons, I think, I'm trying out Shoal again, because the Shoal less version was perfectly fine. And the reason we didn't run Shoal was because we were going for a Traverse build, where you need, I'd say, at least 2, 3, maybe 4. I didn't like the 4th because of Hooting Mandrills. There's a clash there, but you need a lot of Traverse the Ulvenwalds. Tarfire becomes great, and Mishra's Bauble is at the very least okay, often good. You have a lot of spells that are not blue. Bauble. Bauble was the card that I took out. There you go. Bam. Anybody who continued watching this video got to figure that out. I hope you feel rewarded. So anyways, you had 1 Tarfire dropped, 1 Traverse dropped, 1 Bauble dropped. That's already 3 cards. That's kind of at least somewhat a big deal. A lot of other people were, I think, running even more than that. They had 4 Traverse, 2 Tarfire, 2 Bauble. When you get to the sideboard, you'll notice you don't see any blue cards here. Post-board, Shoal gets even worse, because we're generally taking out some number of Thought Scour, maybe a Vapor Snag if you're up against Burn. I'd probably take out Simic Charm too. Of course, Dismember goes, but that doesn't help when you bring in a card that is not blue. So you'll notice Shoal really wasn't that excuse me. Shoal wasn't very easy to run in the Traverse build we were playing. So now that I decided I wanted to try out Shoal against Death's Shadow, the Traverse build essentially has to go, and I end up running just a couple to help enable Delver a little bit, help out with our 18 land situation. It's entirely possible one of these lands actually gets cut. It's probably this Wooded Foothills that was essentially added when Probe was dropped. So that would probably be the first land to go if I were to cut a land. It's also possible that the one of mountain becomes an island because a lot of people like 3 island, 1 forest. That was a big thing back while Probe was around. I don't know about that because mountain is still very good when you can fetch it out with a Tarn or a Foothills, and then Bolt burns 1 drop while only losing 1 life. That's pretty nice. The mountain also makes it very easy to or relatively much easier to cast Bedlam Reveler because it's RR. So with the second Reveler going, it's entirely possible that the mountain is further on the outs. Mountain also helps a bit with Blood Moon. Take less damage while still enabling your moon. And I guess it debatably helps Revelry if you're really in a pinch. If you have, say, I don't know, a breeding pool and an island, you can get a mountain, and that feels at least somewhat good. And it's also nice with Traverse. Just being able to fix your red mana a little better if you're in a spot where you have to do that. And there's also the case to be made for Ghost Quarter, which can otherwise have a very nice time cutting you off of red mana completely. Decks that generally run Ghost Quarter include Hate Bears. That's a deck where you very much like to be casting Lightning Bolt, Tarfire, and Pyroclasm. Mountain becomes a little better. So anyways, that's what we have for Disrupting Shoal. I initially was thinking 2 Spell Snare, 1 Disrupting Shoal, probably keeping the 3rd Traverse. I didn't want to do that right off the bat because I don't know how good Spell Snare is going to be. Spell Snare is, I think, at least okay against Death's Shadow because Tarmogoyf, and every now and then you'll nab a Temur Battle Rage. Another deck I was worried about going too big on Spell Snare was Bant Eldrazi, because I think they run maybe like two CMC cards that they'd want to use against us, maybe 3. They have some Blessed Alliance in the sideboard usually. I could see them bringing in Chalice to play on 1, so you could theoretically grab that. But if Bant Eldrazi becomes a big thing, currently it's at about 5% according to MTG Goldfish, 4.75 if you want me to be specific. So if that becomes a bit bigger, or if we really want to metagame against that, Spell Snare becomes a lot worse. The best thing about Spell Snare in the Bant Eldrazi matchup is you can pitch it to Disrupting Shoal to counter Path to Exile or Noble Hierarch. Another big thing we did was cut a Snapcaster Mage. With Death's Shadow becoming better, and a lot of, well, I expect mid-range to be good due to Death's Shadow's presence, a lot of the people who were playing mid-range are now on Death's Shadow, which is still a mid-range deck, don't get me wrong, but it's a far leaner mid-range deck where card advantage isn't nearly as important. Like I said in the previous video, I don't think Bedlam Reveler is going to be great against it. I'll probably bring it in every now and then during my testing just to see, but I don't think card advantage is going to be a huge deal here. So I don't think we really want to go that big, if you will, as in going like over, under, beat down, not beat down, with Snapcaster Mages. So I think cutting 1 is a good idea due to cutting the Traverse the Ulvenwald to help support Disrupting Shoal. Because Traverse the Ulvenwald, essentially, if you're running 3, you have basically 21 lands. That's a lot more lands than I used to run. Back when Probe was around, we ran 17 lands. Of course, we had a 56 card deck, but 17 is not a lot of lands. 18 is more than 17, of course, but 18 and 2 Traverse, I don't think I want to be running 2 Snapcasters with that. I have, obviously because of variance, been stuck on 2 lands before. Snapcaster's very bad when you're stuck on 2 lands. This doesn't happen all the time, but the fewer Traverses and the fewer lands you run, the more often that's going to happen. So I think I like hedging against that by cutting a Snapcaster Mage. That basically caused me to add this Simic Charm, which takes over for the 2 CMC pitch that Snapcaster Mage covered. The Simic Charm I like better than a second Vapor Snag, I think, which these two cards basically fight for their slots because they're incredibly similar. Simic Charm is generally better against mid-range decks, which, once again, cutting Traverse, going down to 1 snap, I want to hedge that matchup a little bit because we're basically saying we also cut a Bedlam Reveler, so we're going even worse against that matchup. We're basically saying mid-range is less popular. We don't care as much about playing against mid-range. We're going to tune or tweak our deck to fight decks that aren't mid-range. But we don't want to make our deck so much in that direction that we get slaughtered by Jund and Obzon. That's a bad idea. Those are still very popular. I don't want to die. I like living and winning. So what I think we do is run Simic Charm because it's very good against those matchups. It lets Mandrills run over a Goyf, it wins Goyf Wars, it bounces to give you lethal, and it gives you hexproof. Simic Charm counters Abrupt Decay. That's cool. That's very cool. It's also extremely versatile because it's modal. One card I've had suggested to me before on Tapped Out is Blossoming Defense. It's basically a less versatile Simic Charm. Simic Charm is Blossoming Defense plus Giant Growth plus Vapor Snag. It's obviously slightly worse than all of those because it's 2 mana, and Simic Charm, of course, causes the other guy to lose 1 life. However, Simic Charm sometimes causes you to lose 1 life when you absolutely need to save your guy, so that's sometimes sad. But Simic Charm really is better, I think, against mid-range decks than Vapor Snag. So if we're going less in the mid-range direction with Traverse and Snap, I like running Simic Charm. Simic Charm also works against Vapor Snag because it pitches for 2 to Shoal. Against mid-range decks, we generally want to pitch for 2, whereas against non-blue control decks, which really I think are just the mid-range decks, so that just doesn't matter. Against blue control decks, you like hitting Snapcaster Mage. Other than that, you probably want to get Spell Snare, you want to get the Lightning Bolts, but everybody playing a control deck is going to play removal. If they're playing blue and they're not playing another color for removal, they're probably just playing like infinite turns or something like that. So that doesn't really matter as far as our pitching thing goes. That deck also is not very popular, I think. It might be more popular than Rug Delver, but that doesn't really say anything at all. So you like hitting Tarmogoyf, Snapcaster Mage, Dark Confidant, cards like that. Excuse me. The heavy hitters are usually the 2 CMC slot in the mid-range decks, so we like to pitch for 2 against them. That's another reason Simic Charm takes the slot over Vapor Snag here. It's good against mid-range decks on its own, and when you have Shoal in your deck, it's good against mid-range decks that way. We cut the Tarfire mostly to support Shoal, because it's not blue. Every card that you run that isn't blue makes Shoal worse, and I want to be in that sweet spot where Shoal isn't at its best because every card in my deck is blue. That's ridiculous, but I also don't want to have too many cards not be blue and not be able to use Shoal effectively. So I want to be in the sweet spot of marginal cost equaling marginal benefit slash revenue for you economics people out there. So that's why we cut the Tarfire. Another reason we can cut Tarfire is we go down to essentially 7 1-mana removal spells. I will count Dismember, although it's awful against Burn. And we added 3 counter spells that are extremely effective at countering 1-mana spells and to an extent 2-mana spells, which are usually the things that you like to hit with your 1-mana burn spells. So Shoal kind of covers the lost ground from the Tarfire. Bauble has to go to help Shoal out. It also goes because we're running fewer traverses, so it's going to be less effective overall. And I believe that's all for the main board. We will go to the sideboard very quickly. Bedlam Reveler comes out because I needed space for this traverse, and I expect Bedlam Reveler to not be good against Death's Shadow, which is where a lot of the mid-range deck's going, so a lot of the matchups where Reveler was good are now matchups where I don't want Reveler in my deck. So I think having 1 is going to be better than having 2. Once again, this could very well change. And now I will briefly discuss the directions that I think I may or may not end up going with this after testing. Engineered Explosives is probably extremely good against Death's Shadow. It's also good against a number of other mid-range decks. And Death's Shadow is very popular. Another thing you may notice from the MTG Goldfish page is there are not a lot of aggro decks here. I'm looking at, you guys can't see this because I only keep X-Mage on OBS because I never actually bothered to figure out how to do 2 windows, but that's okay because you can just listen. And I'll only be here for like 20 seconds, so don't get mad at me, please. I see Burn, I see Merfolk, I see Obzon Company. Obzon Company is not quite as aggressive, but there's a certain direction I'm going with this. I see Affinity. Grixis Delver doesn't really count because it no longer runs Young Pyromancer, so it doesn't fit my argument. So Affinity, that's 1, Burn 2, Merfolk 3, Obzon Company 4. 4 decks here with a metagame share of 2% or more. I'm back on X-Mage, so I can see what you see again. Those are the decks that I like to bring in Pyroclasm against. Burn, really, Pyroclasm doesn't even always come in because on the draw I like Pyroclasm because it can clean up more. On the play, I prefer Mana Leak, so Pyroclasm's not even always in against Burn. I think if I want more engineered explosives, Pyroclasm is the first thing to get cut. Going below 2 sweepers is something I've never done, and I don't believe anyone who plays this deck has ever recommended it, but engineered explosives also happens to be a slightly more expensive sweeper. Unless, of course, you want to sweep tokens, then it's just the same cost, and technically at instant speed with slight amounts of sorcery speed commitment. But anyways, those are the decks that I would bring Pyroclasm in against. A lot of the decks where I like Pyroclasm, such as Elves, pretty much every other tribal deck, Elves, Slivers, Allies. I'm not going to spend too much time trying to think of it because that would waste your time. I'm assuming your time's valuable. So anyways, the decks that Pyroclasm is good against are a lot rarer than they probably used to be, or maybe they just were never all that common in the first place. But I think they used to be around more. Engineered Explosives happens to be very good against the decks that I mentioned off of MTG Goldfish's page. It's good against Affinity. If you explosives for 2, you can force Ravager activations, you can nab every cranial plating on the battlefield, which basically hoses them, and if you manage to pay 3 different colors for explosives, you have an out to Etched Champion, a card that usually just kicks our ass. So that's pretty nice. If we look at Burn, we don't want explosives, but at the same time, I only ran Pyroclasm half the time, so that's okay. I can live with having 1 Pyroclasm. If we look at Merfolk, explosives is probably better than Pyroclasm. You could theoretically have trouble casting it for 2. That's where we want to cast it, if they are very aggressive on their spreading seizing. But even if they cut you off a color, you should have 2 more, and you should never be going Island Stomping Ground in this matchup, because that just begs for them to cut you off of red and green at the same time. So you should almost always be able to cast explosives for 2, and you should have a very good time wiping out every lord that they have. If you play it for 1 and you're really desperate, you could even nab an Aether Vial. Against Obzon Company, I think it will still be effective. Obzon Company and Merfolk are matchups where it's a little iffy because I like Pyroclasm, but at the same time they can make their things very big. Merfolk has Lords, Obzon Company has Gavany Township, and of course bolster triggers off of Anafenza, the not foremost Kintry Spirit. So those are ways that they can make your Pyroclasm bad, and it's possible that Engineered Explosives is theoretically better. It's also very well theoretically worse, but I'm not metagaming against these decks. I'm more making sure that I still have outs to these decks. So I definitely want 1 Pyroclasm, Well, I'm almost certain I want one Pyroclasm. I can't say that I know that for sure because I don't. Although I could say that, but I'd be lying, and I don't want to lie to you. But I think if Death's Shadow is bad in the matchup, not the deck seems very good. If the matchup's bad, I probably want another Engineered Explosives, and that's where I'd go to cut it. Another spot you can take it from, people have been doing this, they've been cutting a Destructive Revelry, or rather the Destructive Revelry, because we used to run one Ancient Grudge. Back when I first started playing this deck, I think it was two Ancient Grudge, two Revelry. Ancient Grudge got trimmed back a bit to make room for, I believe, Bedlam Reveler and Traverses. And now people are cutting both Destructive Revelries for Engineered Explosives. I don't like cutting both because Revelry also is your only out to a Resolved Worship. And it's quite nice against, say, Ensnaring Bridge. Of course, you could explosives that too, but still. It also does damage, which is very nice. I really like the damage off of Revelry. Burn benefits from it a lot. We also benefit from it quite a bit because we are off in the beatdown. So that's very nice. I don't like cutting both Revelries. I think that's probably maybe wrong as far as percentage points go. But once again, I could very well be wrong. It's probably just personal preference. So yeah, I don't like cutting the second Revelry for the Engineered Explosives, so really it comes down to the second Pyroclasm, and it's also entirely possible that this Dismember goes. I like Dismember against Eldrazi decks, because it kills pretty much all of their threats. I don't count Ulamog, because if Ulamog resolves, you're probably dead, and even if Ulamog is cast and doesn't resolve, he's exiling two of your permanents, which sucks, so you're already in a bad way. So Dismember is very good against Eldrazi decks, and Eldrazi Tron, while not as rising, I want to say, its metagame share isn't going up like Death's Shadow is, but it's still going. So that's something to keep in mind of when we're making these changes. We don't want to metagame against the most popular deck and end up with an awful matchup against the second most popular deck. That's kind of silly, I think. So I like Dismember. I like it a lot. I've very much been enjoying the 1-1 split. And I like the second one against Eldrazi. The reason that second Dismember could be shoved out the door for an Engineered Explosives is Dismember is looking to not be great against the Death's Shadow deck. Of course, that's not necessarily an argument for pulling it, depending on how good our Death's Shadow matchup is otherwise, and Dismember is also good against the Pyroclasm Engineered Explosive matchups a little bit. For example, Master of Waves. It's our only out to Master of Waves if you don't count Vapor Snag, Simic Charm, and countering it. So there's that. Of course, maybe running one is totally fine, but Dismember is still a good card. So unless our Death's Shadow matchup is very bad, and it does seem like we should keep both Pyroclasms, I think that that Dismember can stay. The reason, like I said, that I might get rid of it is it could very well be awful against Death's Shadow. Death's Shadow can sometimes grow at instant speed in response to your Dismember, not always. Sometimes it will just be a 6/6 and your Dismember looks silly. Of course, there's always the Dismember Lightning Bolt play, but that feels awful. I will 2-for-1 myself and pay 4 life and 2 mana to get rid of your 1-drop. That just hurts. That hurts me very deeply on the inside. And there's also the fact that their other main threat is Tarmogoyf, which, if you've played or seen the matchup, gets very, very big. We still want to be able to enable Traverse and our Tarmogoyfs, so we're putting things in the graveyard, and they like enabling their Traverses and their Goyfs, so they're putting even more things in the graveyard. So it is not rare, I don't think, for Goyf to be a 5/6 in the matchup. 5/6s survive Dismember. That's a bad thing. So it's entirely possible that Dismember is bad, and it gets cut. From the sideboard, I mean, I'm almost certainly keeping the one mainboard copy. That seems like gravy at this point. Not running Probe, and running, say, Mountain and Traverse means we take less damage off of probing and our mana base, because we can get more basics, and we can get basics more easily with Traverse. So I think running Dismember is a good idea. I've liked it so far, so I don't intend to cut our mainboard copy yet, if at all. The sideboard copy is on the watch list. So what I'm looking at potentially cutting with my further changes are Dismember, Pyroclasm. I don't think I cut the one of Explosives. If anything, I add more Explosives. If mid-range decks become absolutely terrible, I could see Bedlam Reveler leaving, but I don't think that they're A, going to become terrible, and B, the opportunity cost of having Bedlam Reveler in the deck is one slot, and you essentially have 5 copies to draw because of the traverses. So I think he offers a lot more than he takes away. I like my Huntmasters. I don't see trimming any of those. Blood Moon is an excellent card. If Death's Shadow appears to be very resilient to Blood Moon due to Traverse the Ulvenwald, it's theoretically possible maybe you want a Spreading Seas. I don't know. I may or may not be on the lookout for that. I think there are a lot more prominent things that we can focus on, so I don't think that's something that I'll look towards. 3 Blood Moon is probably almost certainly what you want to be doing, especially against decks like Obzon and a lot of control decks that like Manland, so I don't think I'm even going to pay attention to the possibility of Spreading Seas, but Spreading Seas seemed very good in the Merfolk match against it at GP Vancouver, so that was neat. Of course, we don't get Island Walk, but it's something to consider if they're very good against Blood Moon and we want to attack their mana base. Spreading Seas becomes very good. I don't think I'll be cutting Revelry, and Ancient Grudge is basically a sacred cow to me. That card's amazing against Affinity and other artifact decks. All of these creatures stay. It's possible the second Snapcaster comes back in. Like I said, I could end up reversing a lot of the changes I made. Shoal could come out or be trimmed to a 2-1 split with Spell Snare, possibly a 2-1 split of Spell Snare being the 2, Shoal being the 1, depending on how good Shoal actually is. I'm wary about Shoal against Death's Shadow because they run 8 main deck discard spells, plus I think Collected Brutality, which is a lot, and traditionally Disrupting Shoal is bad against the mid-range decks that run all of the discard spells because they can A, take your Disrupting Shoal, B, take the card you want to pitch to Disrupting Shoal if you have Snap and Shoal in hand, and you're hoping to Shoal their 2-drop, and they take your Snapcaster Mage, you A, lost your Snapcaster Mage, which is great in those matchups, and B, now your Disrupting Shoal is not going to do very much. It may just rot in your hand. And there's also the fact that Shoal may not be where you want to be in that matchup. I think countering their 1 CMC spells for free is exactly what we want, but I don't know if in practice Shoal is going to be reliable enough with all their discard spells. Spell Snare I don't see cutting below 1 because the card is just so good when it's good, and it's almost never bad, especially if Disrupting Shoal is good, because then Snare can often pitch to Shoal, and that's also very good, like I mentioned against Bant Eldrazi. So I think 1 Spell Snare stays for sure. The 3 Denials and 3 Leaks have been in the deck since I started playing it, so unless Disrupting Shoal and Spell Snare prove to be amazing in this meta, and I don't want a lot of counter spells, I don't see cutting those at all. If for some reason I only want, say, 7 or 8 counter spells, and it becomes evident that Shoal and Snare are the best counter spells I could possibly have, then sure, I could see trimming Leaks and Denials, but as is, those cards are great, and they're not leaving. I don't see why I would drop below 4 bolts, and I think 2 Tarfire is right. I used to run 7 1-mana burn spells with Probe around. With Probe gone, a lot of people have thrown in Dismember as another 1 CMC removal spell, so I think still having 7 is at the very least perfectly fine. Tarfire is good for Tarmogoyf, it's good for Traverse, it's just a good card, so I don't see trimming that. Snag and Simic Charm are a large point of tension because usually one is better than the other. So it is very possible that Snag or Charm get the boot for the second copy of the other card. So that's something I'll be looking out for. And, well, the cantrips are staying for sure. Traverse, the pseudo cantrip, could theoretically go down to 1, maybe even 0, if we need to just absolutely be full on tempo. But I don't think I'm going to do that because I have enjoyed running 1 to 2 Traverse for a very long time since I discovered that Traverse was a very good card. So I think that's very good. And like I think I said, I mentioned it on MTG Salvation. So if you like the deck, definitely go there. There's a link in either my descriptions or just on the channel page. So check that out if you're very interested in the deck. I could see cutting the 18th land for another Traverse, or maybe even just for another spell, if the deck runs very smoothly, because we really don't need that much mana, especially when you're running 1 snap and a bunch of shoals. So that's it. I hope that wasn't too long. I hope I didn't lose anybody's attention span. And I hope that was interesting and or informative. And I hope you guys liked it. Like I said, it's entirely possible that I change a lot of things, and what I end up running may not look much like this deck. I'll be sure to give you another update when I do make those changes. And I will probably be playing, let me save this, I'll probably be playing this version in my videos until I do make any more changes, because I think this is probably better than what we were running against what the meta will look like, even if it's not the ideal list that we will potentially discover later on. So, bye.